So, hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, coming to you for another Zoom presentation. And today we are talking about organic gardening. So, I want to start off just talking about what organic gardening is. This information is taken from the USDA's organic website, which, of course, is a really good resource for information about organic gardening. And the goal of organic agriculture is to produce products using methods that preserve the environment, avoid the use of the majority of synthetic materials, such as pesticides and antibiotics, for different fertilizers. And the standards for organic gardening are set down in the Organic Foods Production Act, and they define all of the specifics for the organic standards regarding what can and cannot be done in organic gardening. The idea behind organic gardening is that by using these methods, the producer will preserve natural resources, avoid the use of materials that are not allowed under those standards, um, and the certification is allows the use of that USDA organic symbol as a marketing tool for the producer. And a lot of the people who get interested in organic gardening are interested in it because of a perceived health benefit to organic produce in comparison with conventional produce, or they're interested in benefits to the environment, whether that be avoiding damage to any native insect populations through the reduced use of pesticides, um, really the increased use of cultural methods in a lot of the management decisions that we make in gardening. And other people are really interested or have a perception that organic produce just tastes better. One of the things that I do think is valuable about buying organic, particularly at the local level, is that often that provides us with an outlet where we can support local and small scale producers, particularly topical for right now when support of those local producers is incredibly important. So I just want to spend just a quick moment talking about the organic certification process. And really, in order to use that USDA organic symbol, a producer who sells more than $5,000 worth of a product per year has to have certification in order to use that and in order to use the term organic. Um, Oftentimes when you particularly if you go to a farmer's market, you might see a product being marketed as being naturally grown or pesticide free or chemical free or all natural or sustainable, and there really is no standard or regulation on the use of those terms. There is a certification that's required for the use of the term organic, but again, that really is limited for producers that sell more than $5,000 worth of product in a year. So the process of certification um, begins with contacting an agency that does the organic certification. That is not done through the Mississippi Department of Agriculture and Commerce. So the agencies that do certification are private companies that have gone through the process of becoming those certifying agencies. And they have an application procedure that you'll go through. Generally begins with filling out that application, submitting some initial fees. That application is reviewed by the certifying agency. Generally, after that, it is followed by an on site inspection. One of the things that is particularly important as part of the certification process, particularly if you're a producer that's converting from conventional production over to organic production, is that the field inputs for a period of 3 years have to meet with those organic standards. So you absolutely need to really have very good records on what has been introduced into the field. If it's a property that has not been in production previously, even then you'll need to have as much evidence as possible to indicate that there's been no synthetic chemicals or synthetic chemical fertilizers that have been applied to that area for that required period of time. And so after you go through all of that review, you can be certified. And it's also important to understand that as part of that, maintaining that organic certification, there is an annual review process. So you have that initial review in order to establish that organic certification. And then following that, there is a continual re-renewal process on an annual basis. And that can be an issue for people who want to begin or get organically certified, simply because there is an economic cost to that. So that very often may be why you see people selling things as being naturally grown or sustainably grown, because the certification process, particularly for small scale producers, can be a little bit challenging. So with that, I will kind of start talking about the uh, different aspects of organic production that I am going to cover for today. And I really want to start with organic fertilization. Um, of course, in organic production, we're not allowed to use chemical fertilizers, the kind of fertilizers that you're generally going to find at a big box store, like Triple 13 and other things like that. The components of organic fertilizers are going to be materials that regularly occur in nature or are used as the byproduct or end product of a naturally occurring process. Now, there are going to be some components or organic fertilizers that don't derive from a living organism, but are still used in organic fertilization. That's going to include things like limestone or rock phosphate, some forms of saltpeter that are used um, to fill in some of the needs for fertilization. Some of the common things that are used in organic fertilization, again, we're looking at natural products here. So fish emulsion is very commonly used as a product that's very high in all of the principal elements, nitrogen and phosphorus, has a lot of different trace elements involved. Other materials that you'll often see would be bone meal or a blood meal. Bat guano is another common component. Poultry manures, again, are a frequent thing that's used as an organic fertilizer. But again, the major thing here is that all of these come from a natural source. And because of that, there are some advantages to the use of organic fertilizers. One of these is that the nutrients that are used in organic fertilizers tend to be in larger, more complex molecules, and they take time to break down in the soil to a form that's going to be available to the plant. That nutrient breakdown happens with the action of microbes in the soil that break down those larger, more complex molecules into the much more simple nutrients that are uptaken by the plant. Because they take time to break down, because they're larger and more complicated, they tend to leach less out of the soil as water moves through it. And so they tend to be more, they tend to be available to the plant more long term. And because they tend to be broken down more slowly, and because the nutrients tend to be in a more dilute state, because it's not so strong a material, you're less likely to have a nutrient burn or fertilizer burn occur through the application of organic fertilizer. And again, those nutrients are going to be available for a long time. One of the things that is particularly important about organic fertilization is that it has been fairly demonstrably shown that the use of organic fertilizers promote the growth of good populations of soil microorganisms. In the soil, there are bacteria and fungi that have a very close relationship with plants. And those microorganisms, as we're learning more about them, are extraordinarily important for the health and the growth of the plant. And again, it's been fairly demonstrably shown that organic fertilizers promote those populations of soil microorganisms in comparison with conventional agriculture. Also, because organic fertilizers tend to have all of that organic material in them, they tend to promote good soil structure. As we talked about soil in the past, we talked about how to address sandy soils or heavy clay soils. And generally speaking, the answer to that is to introduce an organic material. And so through using organic fertilizers, you're introducing that organic material that's going to improve that structure of the soil, increase its water holding capacity, increase what we call its tilth, or its ability to grow good plants. Another advantage there is long-term sustainability. We've talked about that as well. Often the materials we're using as organic fertilizer would otherwise go to waste. And so by being able to use those as a fertilizer, we are recycling them, keeping them out of landfills, and being able to reuse that product in a productive way. I just wanted to show a picture here. I mentioned the good soil microorganisms. Mycorrhizae are fungi that live in the soil and have a symbiotic relationship with plants. And they're really responsible in large part for the ability of those plants to take up nutrients from the soil. So that's just kind of an example of those good soil microorganisms that I was discussing just a few moments ago. Now, there are some things about organic fertilizers that do present a few difficulties. One of those is that when we're just looking at a natural product, if you think about a poultry manure or something like that, can be a little bit difficult to determine accurately how much of a nutrient we're applying. Certainly, we can test those products to determine how much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium is available. We also need to kind of consider how those products are breaking down, how they're reacting within the soil, and how that nutrient is being freed up to be used by the plant. And sometimes that's a far more complex relationship than we would see in a mineral fertilizer. So it can be a little bit difficult to make sure that we're applying exactly the nutrients that we need. Another issue, or two issues that are really kind of tied together, is that organic fertilizers tend to be have a low percentage of the nutrients that we're interested in. I mentioned earlier triple 13 as being a common synthetic or chemical fertilizer, and those of course has 13% nitrogen, 13% phosphorus, and 13% potassium. And that's a fairly common thing that you would see in a mineral fertilizer. Now, with an organic fertilizer, generally speaking, that it's going to be of a lower strength. So you might see something like 244 or even lower numbers than that. And because they tend to be of low strength, in order to provide all of the nutrients that the plants need, often we're going to have to apply much more of an organic fertilizer than we would for a mineral fertilizer. So there can be some issues there in terms of being able to transport that material to the garden. Some more difficulties involved in how to actually apply that over the area of the garden. So there can be some difficulties there. Uh, and kind of going along with that, there can be an increased cost that's associated with that fertilizer, just not only in purchasing the material, but also transporting and applying it. Another issue that we sometimes do face is that while, generally speaking, it's not that difficult to find sources of nitrogen for organic fertilizers. Sources of phosphorus and potassium are a little bit more scarce, a little bit more difficult to come by. That again can add to the cost or difficulties that might be involved. Whenever you're adding an organic product, it is possible that you do have some contamination with weeds or with insects or diseases, and that's something you do need to be careful about. Kind of branching away from a purely organic approach, one thing that is fairly practical and has those benefits of organic fertilization is to use a mixed approach. And that would be the use of organic fertilizers to build soil fertility over time, but with a supplemental use of chemical fertilizers to provide that additional nutrition, particularly when it's needed by the plant. And generally speaking, the recommendation there for a transition to organic is that you use that method, and as you build soil fertility, you can kind of taper off the use of those chemical fertilizers. Another application of chemical fertilizers that kind of leads to an organic fertilizer is the addition of chemical nitrogen sources, so a traditional fertilizer in preparing compost, and then using that compost directly in the garden. I just want to give a few examples of different organic fertilizers that are used. I've already mentioned compost, and I do encourage you, if you'd like just a basic introduction to composting, you can find that video posted. Because you can see our compost does have some amount of those three primary nutrients that we're interested in fertilization: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And as I mentioned, they do tend to, it is a fairly low concentration, but again, you're not only getting that nutrient, you're also getting the soil building properties that go along with that. Some other common organic materials that are used, you can see blood meal there as a really good source of nitrogen. Fish meal is both a good source of nitrogen and phosphorus. And you get down to poultry manure, you can see that it has a fairly good percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And at the commercial level, and even potentially as we talk about the homeowner level, poultry manure has a lot of potential because of the importance of the poultry industry here in Mississippi. So that is a material that is often taken from those poultry houses and then used, so it's not being thrown away, used in organic agriculture. And as more people are interested in organic agriculture, we are seeing an expansion of commercially available organic fertilizers. These are products that you can go down to the local garden store and purchase as organic fertilizers and use them directly in your garden. And as a small scale homeowner, other than just composting and having that material available, this is a really convenient way for you to be able to get the benefits of organic fertilization without having to have large issues with with difficulties in transport and application of those fertilizers. Now, getting into some other practices that can be important to promote soil fertility, green manure is the use of green growing plants, growing those in the area where you have your garden, and waiting for them to come up. And as they reach the appropriate stage, tilling those right back into the ground in order to improve your soil condition. Now, they're generally taking up those nutrients right from the ground, so tilling those in is really a big issue about about making those nutrients available. Though there are some advantages there, but a lot of this is in putting that biomass into the ground and really improving your soil structure. Now, there are those advantages of green manure. Again, that addition of organic matter, and the usual recommendation of that is a 3-year rotation with a harvestable crop. So using vegetables as our example here, planting vegetables, and then planting your green manure produces enough of that organic matter to really benefit your soil structure. But as it decomposes, you need to reintegrate it in and keep that cycle going. Now, it is possible to use legumes as a green manure specifically to fix nitrogen. So legumes have a soil bacterium that's associated with them that allows them to take atmospheric nitrogen, which is just elemental nitrogen, and convert that into a form that the plant can use. And so in poor nitrogen soils, using legumes can actually add nitrogen to the soil if you till those legumes back in. If you harvest that crop, or if you take that green crop away, the nitrogen that was fixed is going to be tied up in that crop. So you really do have to till that legume into the soil in order to see those benefits. Another benefit of green manure is their use as what we call a catch crop. And really the focus there is to conserve nutrients by tying them up in that plant. So if we're not growing our primary crop in that soil, we want to avoid any nutrients that might be there leaching away. So using a catch crop, again, ties up those nutrients in the structure of that plant. And then as we till it back in, we're just preventing that nutrient from going away. Kind of a similar idea to that is the use of a cover crop, which really is there to just stabilize the soil against erosion. If you have bare ground, then it might be prone to eroding away due to the action of wind or the action of water. Adding that cover crop in stabilizes it. So getting into some other issues we want to face or tackle for organic gardening, plant selection is really important. Of course, if we're growing organically, then we really do need to start with organic certified seed. That is going to be a requirement. And some things that we want to particularly pay attention to is a lot of our management of problems like insects and disease really start with our choice of plants. So using varieties that have resistances to common pests is a really good idea. And choosing our crops based on their susceptibility to particular pests may be important. A really good example of that, just to kind of compare and contrast, would be sweet corn versus a tomato. Now, I don't know that it would be accurate to say that tomatoes do not have any serious pests. They absolutely do. But there's a particular pest in corn that can be very challenging. Corn very often is challenged by corn earworms, and the control of that pest can be very difficult. So choosing your plants based on what challenges they're going to have is something that may be valuable to you. Now, often people who are growing organically are also very interested in heirloom varieties. Those are those varieties plants tend to be open pollinated, or their seed are going to breed true and produce a plant that's essentially the same variety as what you planted. Or the other way to interpret heirloom variety is just a variety that's been around for a long time. But often those older varieties, heirloom varieties, tend to be more susceptible to pests and diseases. So we want to be cautious of that as we're choosing the plants we're using. So I'm going to start talking about sort of some of the different things we're going to need to deal with in an organic garden. I'm going to start off with weed control and use my favorite definition. Weed is just a plant that's growing out of place. Weeds are really important because they're competing with the plants that we want for soil nutrients, for water, and for light, and they're reducing the vigor of the plants through that competition. Additional problems with weeds is that they can serve as a host for insects and diseases that might also cause problems in our crop. And so it's important that we manage them effectively. Now, one of the most important things that we can do in order to promote good weed control is to start off with good, healthy soil that has the right fertility. Making sure that the plants we have are growing very vigorously and giving them the tools in order to outcompete the plants that we don't want. So making sure we have the proper soil pH, have all those proper soil nutrients to make our plants thrive, to form a dense canopy that's going to shade out any potential weeds is going to be really important. If we're growing a crop that can be closely seeded, doing that in order to provide less room for weeds to establish can be very important. And again, just really growing healthy plants. That being said, an essential element of weed control in an organic garden is going to be physical removal of the plants, either by hand or with a hoe. And it's worth noting that that can be time consuming and difficult. There's a lot of labor that's involved in that, and that can present a significant challenge. One tool that we can use in order to get effective control of weeds in organic gardens is mulches. Oftentimes we're talking about a straw material or pine bark material or compost as our mulch. And that mulch is going to provide a physical barrier to any seedlings that might be coming up, as well as preventing light from reaching down to the soil surface and just preventing those weeds from being able to thrive. I mention one other thing about organic weed control. Sort of the very common thing that you might see on different kinds of social media is there are a lot of recommendations for different homemade weed control solutions. Often they're going to contain some mixture of vinegar and salt. And unfortunately, those mixtures just aren't very effective at giving good weed control. You may see the plant burned a little bit by that if you get them, particularly when they're very small. But it doesn't actually tend to be very effective at removing the weeds. So again, mulches and hand removal and really just having really healthy plants are going to be the most important steps that we can take in getting good organic weed control. Moving on to insect pest control. Of course, insects can severely damage plants in a variety of different ways, whether they're feeding on the leaves and fruit or sucking plant sap, or whether they're potentially transmitting some diseases. Insects can be a very serious issue. And it's important to understand that populations build throughout the growing season. So as we're in the early part of the growing season, insect populations tend to be fairly small. But as we get through the season, into the summer and into the fall, we should expect to see larger populations of those insects because they tend to go through more than one generation in a season, and that just allows them to build up. So, the best approach in my mind to management of insects, really management of all sorts of different problems that you might face, regardless of the type of gardening that you're doing, is the use of integrated pest management. And integrated pest management really is just what it sounds like. It is the use of multiple types of control in order to get a better result than what we might get with just one kind of control. So integrated pest management combines a range of different control practices to have more positive effect in reducing pest populations. One of the things that is very important, particularly in organic production, is for us to monitor pest populations. We need to get out and actually check those plants at least once or twice a week, make sure we're not seeing pest populations build up. You don't necessarily need to apply a control for an individual aphid, but as that population increases, it's a lot easier to manage an insect when it's early in its life, early in its development. And it's a lot easier to manage populations of insects when they're small than waiting for a problem to get out of hand and try to reduce it. Particularly as we're trying to use um, no synthetic pesticides, being able to catch those populations early is extraordinarily important. I also recommend keeping records from season to season. Have a notebook or a calendar where you note down just things that you have observed in your garden, pest populations you may have observed in your garden, because having that field history really lets you know what you might expect in future years. Also tell you what worked and what didn't. So if you try to apply a control, you don't get good results out of it. Certainly write that down, because that's something you're going to want to remember when that problem comes up again. Another really important thing for any type of gardening, again, is to know the pests that you're dealing with. Proper identification is going to be really important to having the right management tool to deal with that insect pest. So, if you're growing a particular crop, there are going to be some insects that tend to be the common pests that you see for that particular crop. And being able to recognize that is going to be really important in providing the right control, because different insects are just going to require different treatments. And of course, this is where I need to put in the statement that, certainly I and the other county agents around Mississippi, if you're listening from another state, your county agent, wherever you are, is going to be really happy to help you with insect identification and with recommending a control, whether that be a conventional pesticide or an organically approved one. Some things that are particularly important, again, in organic production is the use of cultural controls for insect pests. And that really is just trying to grow your plant in a way that is going to help you with reducing those pest populations. So again, I already mentioned crop selection and talked about that a little bit. Talked a little bit about resistant varieties, using those varieties that are going to be resistant, particularly insects like thrips and aphids and whiteflies. And resistance can come in a lot of different forms. Some plants are resistant; they're just less attractive. Some plants may have a physical feature, like having really thick hairs on the leaves that might help them resist particular pests. It's also important to grow your plants when pest populations are low. Being able to start earlier in the season will allow you to avoid some late season insects. And kind of by contrast, in some instances, planting a little bit late allows you to avoid some insects like cucumber beetles on melons, bean leaf beetles on peas and beans. Also really important is crop rotation. Insects tend to favor particular crops. And so by changing the crops that you're growing in an area, you can avoid the buildup of those insect populations from year to year. And as I mentioned when I was talking about weed control, weeds can absolutely serve as alternative hosts for different insect pests. They can harbor insects after you've applied a control to your crop. Can also serve as a source for plant diseases. So maintaining really good weed control, tilling in order to mechanically control soil insects, getting that weed control done, it's going to be really important, not only for weeds, but also for insects and diseases, as I'll mention in just a few minutes. Another option for insect pests is the use of trap crops. Trap crops are planted in order to attract pests away from the main crop. A really good example of that is the use of sunflowers to attract leaf-footed bugs. You can see there all of the leaf-footed bugs hanging out on the sunflowers in that picture. It's a very attractive plant to those insects, and so they tend to be attracted there rather than onto the crop you're intending to harvest. Just a couple other examples, the use of collards for diamondback moths, if you're growing cabbages or other greens. Southern peas are really attractive to stink bugs. So what is important about the use of trap crops is that you really need to get effective control of that insect that's on the trap crop while it's on the trap crop. Otherwise, those pest populations can increase on the trap crop, and they'll then move on to the crop that you're growing. So you do need to apply a control to that trap crop to help manage that pest. Destroying old crop residue in the field can help eliminate immature insects or remove overwintering sites for egg laying. Can be very important. Not something that you see out of a lot of homeowners. The use of reflective mulches can reduce thrips and aphid populations. Use of plastic mulches and conventional mulches also really good for cooling the soil later in the season, which can produce healthier plants. Mechanical control is also a important part of insect pest management. In this case, we're talking about the use of a physical barrier between the insect and the plant. Growing your seedlings in an area where bugs really just can't get to them, in an enclosed space, or inside, or in a greenhouse, or a cold frame, something like that. You can see up in that top picture, that is a collar that's placed around that young plant, specifically to avoid damage from a caterpillar pest called a cutworm. The cutworm likes to live in the soil, and then at night it comes up and it does just what you might imagine. It cuts off that plant right above the soil surface by feeding. And just by putting that collar around the base of the plant, you put that physical barrier there, and the cutworm can't reach the plant. Low covers or other kinds of covers for the plant can also serve as a good way to prevent insects from reaching the plants. It just provides a physical barrier that's very effective at preventing those insects from being able to reach the plant in the first place. Just to mention one other aspect of mechanical control, hand removal, particularly as a home gardener, can be an important tool in managing insect pests. So if you have large caterpillars or insects like that, just physically removing those caterpillars may be one of the more effective ways that you can get rid of that pest without needing to resort to a traditional pesticide. Along with that, the egg masses for stink bugs, leaf-footed bugs, and squash bugs tend to be fairly obvious if you're really closely monitoring the plants, and just physical removal of those egg masses can prevent that population from reaching a high level. Biological control of insect pests is a good tool to keep pest populations down. It's generally not something that we're going to be able to use to actually completely remove or eradicate a pest population, but it can prevent that pest population from reaching a damaging level. And different biological controls include predatory insects, like assassin bugs or lady beetles that just directly hunt down and feed on the pest. You have parasites or parasitoids, more properly, that lay their eggs inside the pest and kill it that way. And you also have some pathogens that can be effective, some pathogens for insects that can be effective in reducing pest populations. The cordyceps fungus is an example of that, and you can see some pictures down there at the bottom of caterpillars that have been affected by that fungus. You actually see the fungus growing out of the head of the caterpillar. Some things that are really important for biological control. Obviously, you want to avoid insecticide sprays as much as possible because you don't want to remove the biological control insects, the good insects. You want to provide a diverse range of plant species That's going to foster those beneficial insects and allow them a place to develop their populations. And generally speaking, purchasing lady beetles or purchasing other beneficial insects for release in the garden just isn't effective unless you have an enclosed space like a greenhouse. Simply because those insects tend to leave the garden area rather than just staying in place. Particularly if the pest population is small, then releasing those insects just tends to result in them spreading out beyond the scope of that garden. Now, in regards to insecticide sprays, maintaining these biological pest control or beneficial insects is good, but once your pest population gets really high, gets to a point where it's really damaging, you don't want to avoid pesticides entirely to preserve beneficial insects, simply because they're just not being effective at keeping that population down. So if you do have an herb garden or other plants that are there specifically for the beneficial insects, you can avoid spraying those. Spray your other garden plants, and that way you kind of get the best benefit of preserving some of those beneficial insects while still getting the effective control of the insects that are causing you problems. And now there are a number of organically approved insecticides, that are good for a wide range of different pests. A very common one that is used is spinosad. There are a number of different trade names for that. Very good for thrips and leaf miners, very good for caterpillars. There's actually a granular form for fire ant control in gardens that works very well. If you're following organic standards, need to be careful to ensure that the specific spinosad product that you're purchasing is actually organically certified, because there are some formulations of spinosad that contain some inorganic ingredients that disqualify them from being used in organic production. BT is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's produced by a soil bacterium, very effective for the control of caterpillars when those caterpillars are quite small. Another common one that's used is pyrethrin. That actually comes from a daisy flower, and is a effective contact insecticide. One of the significant things about pyrethrin is it breaks down very quickly in the environment, so you don't get a lot of residual control with it. You really need to have the insect there and contacting it directly with the insecticide. Commonly used for aphids and scale and thrips and other small soft-bodied insects, neem oil and horticultural oils, insecticidal soaps work fairly effectively against those soft-bodied insects, but you don't see a lot of efficacy against larger insects just because of the way that those insecticides work. I want to also comment on disease control for organic production. And a lot of the comments that I'm going to make about disease control really can apply to a lot of other issues. What we're aiming at doing is reducing the populations of the pathogens that cause disease. And again, one practice isn't sufficient. We need to combine a lot of different practices in order to get effective disease control. And no practice is going to work for every disease that can threaten a particular crop. So we want to make sure that we're using all of those diverse methods to get effective control. And often that really is going to need to start before we actually have plants in the ground. And as with insects, we want to make sure that we know the plant diseases that we're dealing with, because that correct diagnosis is going to give us the best direction on how we should manage that particular disease. Just like insects, you want to know the diseases that affect those plants that you're growing. And sometimes with plant diseases, that can be difficult because some of them do look very similar to one another. And again, your county extension agent, I, or any of my coworkers will be very happy to help you with disease diagnosis. I think it's really important, as with disease, as with insects, that we have a record of what we have showing up. So we know we have that history of a particular disease being present in the garden, so we can kind of prepare for how we want to manage that. Now, before we start planting, there are some things we want to do that can help us with disease control. And sanitation really, in my mind, is the core of a good disease control program. You want to destroy or get rid of any crop debris that might be there, because it can serve as an overwintering site for a disease to then reinfest the plants that we're putting in. So any stalks that might still be in the field, any stems or vines, any leaves, anything like that, really need to be removed, plowed under, or otherwise gotten out of the field. And one thing that can be really important, I grow a lot of tomatoes, and we use the cages year after year. So any of those support structures really do need to be cleaned. Any of the stakes, any of the poles, any of those cages need to be disinfested with make sure we don't have that organism still on there, either through use of a copper sulfate solution, or really just bleach solutions are very effective. 1 part bleach to 4 parts water, or 1 part vinegar to 4 parts water, all can be effective methods to clean those support structures. We do want to avoid introducing any pathogens as much as possible. You can see there the note to control weeds. Again, very similar to the comments on insects, because those weeds can serve as a host for disease-carrying insects, because they can actually host the diseases themselves. In terms of using disease-free seeds, using disease-free transplants, if you're saving seeds, then you want to make sure the seeds you're saving are from healthy plants to prevent seed transmission. Buy certified seeds. Buy seeds that come from areas where diseases tend to be less common. And make sure that when you're sowing those seeds, you do that in a sterile growth medium you haven't used before. If you're using flats more than once, you need to make sure that you're cleaning those. And just making sure that we're not introducing any seed into the garden with the plants that we're putting in. We do want to make sure that we have a really good site for our garden, having an area with really good drainage, because a lot of excess soil moisture has the potential to increase seedling diseases. Here in coastal Mississippi, a lot of us are using raised beds specifically to address drainage issues. So that can be very important. Make sure we have really good soil nutrition, have all of that taken care of, because healthy plants tend to be less susceptible to disease. We don't want to put plants too close together. We want to promote airflow through the garden, and make sure they're taking up all the nutrients that they need. Rotating crops, again, just to prevent the buildup of pests or diseases in the garden. Just like with insects, using physical controls can be important. Mulch layers. Mulch serves as a barrier between the soil and the plant. A lot of the diseases tend to reside in the soil year to year. And so having a physical barrier between the plant and the soil, whether that be a mulch layer, or whether that be aluminum foil just wrapped around the base of the plant, can provide an effective barrier between the soil and the plant, and prevent the infection of that plant with the disease. We do want to stake and trellis plants where we can, because keeping them up off the ground is going to, again, prevent the crop from being in contact with the soil, and reduce any losses we might have with fruit rots or other issues. Row covers, again, serve as a effective physical barrier. Often the disease has to be spread in either on the wind or by splashing water. So having that row cover there does an effective job of preventing contact with the plant by that disease inoculum, or contact with the plant by insects. So remember, Sanitation, removing any diseased plants or plant parts that are there. If you're working in the garden, it is important to clean and disinfect your tools. Again, a bleach solution or a vinegar solution can be effective for that. Cultivate in dry conditions so that you're not spreading water from one plant to another to prevent the spread of any disease organisms. And try to avoid moving soil up onto the plant surface, because again, that can serve as a source for the disease spreading onto the plant. There are a somewhat smaller number of chemicals that are approved for use as organic disease control, generally for fungal disease control. Kind of the classic of that is the Bordeaux mixture, which is a mixture of copper sulfate and hydrated lime and water. If you're trying to mix together a gallon of that, you would add 2 tablespoons of copper sulfate and 3 tablespoons of hydrated lime to a gallon of water. You can have some issues there with interaction with insects, with insecticides, as well as some issues with applying that in a really humid environment, because you can see some burn on the plant. A little bit more commonly, you'll see just a copper fungicide that is an effective fungicide for a wide range of different issues. Also has some antibacterial activity, so it can be effective for bacterial diseases. And that's something that you really can go and purchase at a lot of garden stores, and you'll just see that as a copper fungicide. Again, with copper fungicides, you do need to be conscious if there's water on the plants. If you have really high humidity and the temperatures are cool, you can see burn on the plants as a result of applying copper. In terms of biological control for diseases, again, the use of resistant varieties can be particularly important, because you want to start with plants that are just going to be less susceptible to those disease issues. Just to add an interesting note here at the end, French marigolds in particular can be used as in control of nematodes. Nematodes are a small roundworm that lives in the soil. Can be very damaging to root systems of plants. And French marigolds in particular release a chemical that's toxic to nematodes. And so they can be planted as a way to help reduce nematode populations. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very rapid run through a wide range of topics in organic gardening, and a lot of those deserve a much more in-depth discussion, whether that be organic weed control, organic fertilization, or what have you. And so we may look forward to that in the future with this as an introduction. But with that said,